Welcome to Holly's Quiet Harbor. Take a deep breath and let your mind begin to rest. The Lantern Keeper of Bramble Shore. On the western edge of a quiet island, where the sea rolled in like folded blue silk, and the wind smelled of salt and thyme, there stood a lantern house on a cliff. It was not a grand lighthouse, though strangers often called it that when they first arrived by ferry and saw its pale tower rising above the rocks. The people of the island always corrected them kindly. "It is a lantern house," they would say, "a place for keeping light." And because Bramble Shore was the kind of village where words mattered, that distinction meant something. A lighthouse warned, a lantern house welcomed. For many years, the keeper of the lantern house had been a woman named Mara Vale, who had silver in her dark hair and a voice so calm that even nervous dogs settled at her feet when she spoke. She lived alone in the round stone house with its narrow windows, polished brass railings, and long spiraling stair. She kept ledgers of weather and tides, trimmed the wicks, polished the lens, and lit the great amber lamp each evening before dusk unfurled across the sea. There were no ships now that truly needed such a light. Modern ferries had maps and instruments, and the fishing boats knew the coast better than they knew their own hands. Still, the lantern was kept. Some traditions were practical, others were faithful, and some, though no one quite admitted it out loud, were a little bit magical. Mara had one apprentice. Her name was Elin Thorne, and she was 17 years old, with chestnut hair she wore in a braid that rarely stayed neat past noon, and a thoughtful face that seemed made for looking out of windows. She had lived on Bramble Shore all her life. Her father mended nets. Her mother kept bees. Her younger twin brothers were perpetually muddy and always hungry. Their cottage stood inland, among hedges and low stone walls. But whenever Elin could escape her chores, she climbed the cliff path to the lantern house. She had begun visiting Mara when she was 9, delivering jars of honey or warm oatcakes from her mother. By 11, she was trusted to polish the brass. By 13, she could trim the lamp wicks without singeing her sleeves. By 15, she knew the weather from the shape of clouds and could read the tide tables as easily as a favorite book. Now at 17, she was almost grown, and everyone on the island assumed she would soon leave. The mainland college had written twice. Her schoolmaster had told her she had a clever head and wider roads ahead. Her parents, proud and anxious at once, tried not to push. Even Mara, who asked little and observed much, had said only, "Doors have a way of appearing when we are ready. The trick is not fearing them." But Elin did fear them, just a little. Not because she lacked courage. She had rode through bad rain, climbed cliff paths in winter wind, and once stitched a gash in her own palm when she did not want her mother to worry. No, what troubled her was a quieter thing. She didn't know whether leaving would make her larger or smaller. The island had shaped her. She knew the names of all the coves, even the hidden ones. She knew where the blackberries ripened first, and where the seals liked to sleep on sun-warmed rocks. She knew which floorboards in the lantern house sighed when the weather turned. She knew the hour the baker set cardamom buns in the window, and when the ferryman sang to himself on misty mornings. She loved the place so much that the thought of leaving felt like setting down part of her own heart. But staying sometimes felt like refusing to open a gift because the ribbon was too beautiful to untie. So she lived in that unsettled in-between, and because summer had not yet decided whether to arrive properly, the days came cool and bright, carrying the clean restlessness of change. One evening, near the end of May, Mara and Elin stood in the lantern room at the top of the tower. The great lens curved around them in shining panels, catching the last pink light of sunset. Outside, the sea was turning pewter and rose. Far below, gulls skimmed the waves. "Would you hand me the ledger?" Mara asked. Elin passed it over. Mara wrote the date in her neat, slanting hand, then paused. "Elin?" "Yes?" "When was the last time you crossed the island after dark?" Elin blinked. "After dark? Properly after dark?" "Properly." "I don't know. Winter, maybe? Coming back from the watch night supper." Mara nodded, as if some private thought had been confirmed. Then she shut the ledger and said, "Tonight, after we light the lamp, I would like you to take something to Rowan Fen." Elin turned. "At this hour?" "At this hour." Rowan Fen lived on the eastern side of the island, near Willowmere, where the land softened into meadows and little freshwater ponds. He was older than Mara by perhaps 10 years, though he moved with the easy lightness of someone much younger. He built clocks, repaired watches, and had once, long ago, traveled the world as a maker of instruments for ships. At least that was one version of his story. On the island, there were always several versions of a person, and all of them contained some truth. Elin liked Rowan. He spoke slowly, brewed terrible tea, and carried mint lozenges in his pockets for anyone with a cough. But he almost never required anything urgently. "What am I taking to him?" she asked. Mara reached beneath the work table and drew out a wooden box no bigger than a loaf of bread. It was made of ash wood, banded in brass, with a clasp shaped like a tiny crescent moon. "This." Elin took it carefully. It was lighter than she expected. "What is it?" Mara smiled the way she did when she intended not to answer directly. "A thing that should not wait until morning." Elin examined the box. "Will he be expecting me?" "I imagine he will," Mara said. That did not explain anything at all. The lamp was lit. The lens began its slow revolving glow. Darkness deepened over the sea. By the time Elin wrapped her shawl close and stepped out of the lantern house, the first stars were appearing above the cliff. Behind her, the amber light turned in its steady arc, brushing the grass, the rocks, and the long path down toward the village. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment, with her hands folded. "Elin?" "Yes?" "Walk the long way round," Mara said. "Take the upper ridge, then the ash grove, then the path through the old orchard. That adds nearly a mile. I know. Elin hesitated. Why? So you can notice what's there. And then, because Mara was Mara, she went inside without further explanation. Elin stared after her, half amused, half exasperated. Then she adjusted the box under her arm and began walking. The upper ridge path wound along the spine of the island. To her left lay the sea, silver and softly breathing. To her right, inland fields stitched themselves across the hills in dim green squares, bordered by stone walls. Sheep were pale blurs, sleeping in the distance. A late thrush sang from a hawthorn hedge, then fell silent. At first, Elin walked briskly, the way one does when given an odd errand and no satisfactory reasons. But the night was gentle, and the island had a way of setting its own pace. The sky darkened by slow degrees, from dove-gray to violet to deep blue. The moon, not yet full but nearly so, rose above the eastern meadows. The thyme along the ridge released its fragrance where her boots brushed it. Once she stopped to listen to water moving in a hidden cove below. Once she paused to watch a fox cross a far field, with its tail low and bright in the moonlight. By the time she reached the ash grove, her irritation had thinned into curiosity. The grove grew in a fold of land sheltered from the wind. The ash trunks stood pale as old bone, and their leaves murmured overhead. Moonlight sifted through in delicate, shifting coins. Elin had known this place since childhood, but at night it seemed different. Less like a collection of trees, and more like a room someone wise had built a very long time ago. The path through it was soft with last year's leaves. Her footsteps made almost no sound. Halfway through the grove, she saw a light ahead. Elin stopped. Not the sharp yellow of a lantern, nor the white blink of a bicycle lamp either. This light was warmer, like candlelight cupped in glass. It moved. A figure emerged between the trees. "Elin?" came a familiar voice. She let out the breath she'd been holding. "Thomas?" Thomas Wren lifted his lamp. He was 18, lanky, dark-haired, and currently wearing a coat that had once belonged to his older brother and was still a little too broad in the shoulders. He worked with his mother at the island post office and knew the contents of everyone's parcels only by weight, rattle, and handwriting, which had made him both discreet and quietly fascinating to every child on Bramble Shore. He also happened to be Ellen's oldest friend. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I could ask you the same." His eyes dropped to the wooden box beneath her arm. "That looks official." "It feels unofficial," she said. "Mara sent me to Rowan Fen." "At this hour?" "Yes." Thomas considered. "My grandmother sent me to check whether the old ash at the east pasture had split in the wind again." Elin raised an eyebrow. "At this hour?" "Yes," he admitted, "which is suspicious now that I hear it aloud." They looked at one another. Then, without meaning to, both laughed. The laughter loosened something in Elin. That night, which had seemed odd before, now felt almost conspiratorial. Thomas held up a small bundle. "I have 2 seed cakes because Gren assumes every errand is an excuse to prevent starvation." "I'm glad of her foresight," said Elin. They sat on a fallen log beneath the ash trees and shared the cakes, which were crumbly with oats and sunflower seeds, and just sweet enough to keep one reaching for another bite. Thomas poured tea from a dented flask. It was strong and minty. For a little while, they said nothing. The kind of nothing that only exists between people who've known each other a long time. Then Thomas said, "Have you decided?" Elin knew what he meant. "No." He nodded as if he'd expected that. "Have you?" she asked. He shrugged. "About the apprenticeship in the city? Not exactly." Thomas had been offered a place with a watchmaker on the mainland. Everyone said it was a fine opportunity. He liked careful work, liked mechanisms and hidden order. But leaving the island would mean leaving his grandmother, who claimed she was sturdy as old rope and needed no help, though lately she had begun forgetting where she set her spectacles, and once burned a kettle dry because she was certain she had only just put it on. Elin brushed crumbs from her skirt. "Does it feel to you," she said slowly, "as though everyone else thinks choices are doors, but they're really more like tides?" Thomas turned this over. "Meaning?" "Meaning people talk as if you simply choose and step through and there you are. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels as though whole parts of your life pull with the choice. Family, place, who you've been, what you might become." Thomas smiled faintly. "That sounds annoyingly accurate." She smiled too. After a moment, he said, "Sometimes I think I'm afraid that if I go, the island will continue just fine without me." Elin looked at him in surprise. "And if I stay," he went on, staring at the pool of lamplight at his boots, "I'm afraid I'll wonder who I might have been." The ash leaves stirred overhead. Elin felt that old ache of recognition, so sharp and gentle at once, of hearing someone else say the thing you've not known how to say yourself. "We're very inconveniently the same," she murmured. "Yes," said Thomas. "It's one of my best qualities." She laughed again, softer this time. When they rose to continue on, it felt natural, rather than arranged, that they would walk together. The path bent eastward through the old orchard, where gnarled apple trees still stood from a farm long vanished. In the autumn, the fruit was small and tart, but the blossoms in spring were beautiful enough that people made the trip simply to stand among them. Now, the petals had mostly fallen, leaving the air with a faint, sweet green scent. The moon was higher. The island seemed to glow from within. "Do you remember," Thomas said, "when we were 10 and convinced there was treasure buried under the orchard?" Elin groaned. "We dug 6 enormous holes and found nothing but roots and 1 spoon. A respectable spoon, bent beyond use. It had character." They walked on, smiling. Then Elin felt the wooden box shift in her arms and remembered the errand. "What do you suppose this is?" Thomas tilted his lamp toward it. "May I?" she handed it over. He examined the brass bands and crescent clasp. No lock. I noticed. Which means it is intended to be opened by its carrier, he said. Elin stopped in the path. Surely not. Surely yes. Mara did not tell me to open it. She also didn't tell you not to. That is very post office logic. Thank you. She took the box back. The brass clasp caught moonlight. Her fingers hovered over it. It feels rude. It probably is, Thomas admitted. But perhaps productively rude. Elin looked around them. The orchard was quiet, except for a distant owl. No one was there to approve or disapprove. Mara's final words returned to her. Walk the long way round, so you can notice what is there. With a breath that was nearly a laugh, Elin opened the clasp. Inside, nestled in dark blue cloth, lay a compass, but not an ordinary one. Its casing was silver rather than brass, engraved around the edge with tiny curling vines. The face was cream enamel, marked not only with north, south, east, and west, but with smaller words too, in script so fine she had to tip it toward the lamp to read them. Patience, courage, return, listen, begin. The needle, bright and slender, did not point north. It moved in a slow, small circle, then settled toward the east. Thomas leaned closer. That, he said, is not standard. Elin gently lifted the compass from its padding. It felt surprisingly warm. Beneath it was a folded note. This, at least, she recognized as Mara's hand. For the one who must choose by seeing, not by fearing, take it to Rowan, but first follow where it points. Elin read the note twice. Thomas looked over her shoulder. Well, he said, that is undeniably directed. Directed by whom? He glanced at the compass, which still pointed east. I have a guess. East lay Willowmere. Rowan Fenn's house was beyond it. But the compass needle was not pointing to Rowan's cottage exactly. It seemed to angle a little south of the usual path, toward the long meadows and ponds where mist gathered on autumn mornings. Elin wrapped the note around the compass and returned both to the box. This is absurd, she said. Yes, and we're not actually going to follow it. No, said Thomas. Of course not. They stood there. Then Elin adjusted the box under her arm and stepped off the orchard path into the moonlit grass. Thomas lifted his lamp and followed. The meadow sloped gently downward, silver with dew. The grass brushed their calves. Somewhere nearby, frogs were singing in the ponds. The compass tugged less like an object than like a suggestion one could feel through one's skin. They moved slowly, careful of rabbit holes, until at last they saw something ahead that neither of them had expected. A house. Not large, not grand, but unmistakably a house. It stood near the edge of Willowmere, where the reeds began, half hidden by elder trees and wild rose. Its roof was steep and shingled in weather-dark slate. A narrow porch wrapped around the front. The windows were lit from within by a mellow, golden glow. Elin stopped. "That cannot be right," she whispered. She knew every house on Bramble Shore. Or had thought she did. Thomas lowered his lamp, though the strange cottage needed no extra light. "Have you ever seen this before?" "Never." A stone path curved through the grass to the porch. Wind stirred the elder leaves. From inside came the faint sound of music? No, not music exactly. Wind chimes, perhaps, or glass gently touching glass. Ellen's heart thudded, not with fear, but with the peculiar thrill of finding the world larger than it had been an hour ago. The compass needle in the box trembled once and stilled. They approached. On the porch sat an old woman in a wicker chair, as if she'd been expecting them all evening. She wore a plum-colored shawl and soft gray slippers. Her white hair was braided in a crown around her head. In her lap lay a basket of wool the color of rain clouds. And in her hands, knitting needles clicked quietly. "About time," she said, without looking up. "I was beginning to think Mara had sent you by boat." Elin stopped at the bottom step. "I'm sorry?" The woman lifted her head and her eyes were clear and merry. "You'll do," she said. "Both of you. Come up. Mind the loose board near the door." Thomas and Elin exchanged a glance and obeyed. The porch smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. Up close, the cottage looked old in a way that was difficult to place. Not neglected. Everything was sound and well cared for, but old as if it had been standing not merely for years, but for a long accumulation of evenings. The woman set aside her knitting. "I am Astrid Rowan," she said, "though once I was Astrid Vale. And before that, simply Astrid, which was enough for anyone with sense. Mara is my sister." "Elin Thorne," Elin said quickly, "and this is Thomas Wren." "Yes, I know," Astrid replied. "You have the look of yourselves." Thomas seemed about to ask what that meant, but thought better of it. Astrid's gaze dropped to the box. "Did she send the compass at last?" Elin nodded and held it out. Astrid did not take it. "Open it." Elin obeyed. Astrid peered at the compass face and made a satisfied sound. "Still insolent. Good." "What is it?" Elin asked. "A choosing compass." "There is such a thing?" "There is now." Astrid rose with some effort, though without frailty, and opened the cottage door. "Come in, before the tea loses all courage." Inside, the house was warm and full of lamplight. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with books, jars of dried herbs, shells, polished stones, bits of brass, spools of thread, maps, old instruments, and a dozen objects whose purpose Elin could not guess. A fire glowed softly in the grate, though the night was mild. On a table by the window stood a blue teapot and 3 cups. The whole room felt less like a house than like the inside of a very thoughtful mind. Astrid settled them at the table and poured tea fragrant with chamomile and orange peel. "Mara told me very little," Elin said once they were seated. Astrid gave a short laugh. Mara tells very little. It's how she prevents people from cluttering good moments with premature explanations. Thomas nearly choked on his tea. Astrid folded her hands. You're both standing at the edge of leaving. Elin glanced at Thomas. Is everyone on the island aware of this? Only anyone with eyes. Astrid continued. That in itself is not unusual. Young people leave islands. Sometimes they return, sometimes they don't. But there's a difference between choosing with your whole self and being pushed by fear in one direction or another. Elin looked down at the compass. I remember, Astrid said, when Mara and I were young. She wished to stay. I wished to travel. We each thought the other braver, which was foolish. Staying can require a fiercer courage than leaving. Leaving can be an act of devotion rather than escape. The problem comes when we name one path noble and the other selfish. Life is rarely so tidy. The fire shifted softly. Astrid reached for the compass and held it out toward Elin. This belonged to my grandfather. He was a shipwright. He didn't trust ordinary compasses in matters of the heart. What does it do? Thomas asked. It points, Astrid said. Yes, but to what? Well, that depends on the one carrying it. Elin turned the compass in her hands. The needle wavered, then settled toward the hearth. Astrid smiled. It does not tell you what to do. If it did, it would be useless. People only grow through choices they actually make. No, it points toward what must be seen before a choice can be made well. Elin absorbed this quietly. Astrid rose and crossed to a cabinet. From it, she drew a folded map, old but lovingly repaired. She spread it on the table. It showed Bramble Shore in detailed ink lines. Cliffs, coves, meadows, wells, orchards, even the ruined chapel on the south end. But there were also marks Elin had never seen on any official map. Tiny stars, crescent moons, little lantern symbols, and a ring of dots around Willowmere. These are not places the island reveals to everyone, Astrid said. Only to those who are listening at the right moment. Thomas leaned in. Is that why we found this cottage? Yes, you were invited. Why? Astrid looked at him over the top of her spectacles. Because you were willing to follow a mystery without first demanding a guarantee. Thomas sat back, unexpectedly pleased. Astrid traced a finger across the map to a small symbol near the eastern ponds. There's an old footbridge here, half swallowed by reeds. Beyond it is a path leading to a garden that belonged to the first keeper of the lantern house. Few remember it now. Fewer still find it. A hidden garden? Thomas said. Astrid ignored the childish delight in his voice, only because she shared it. Elin, take the compass there. Sit a while. Ask it nothing. Simply notice. Elin frowned. And then? Then, bring the compass to Rowan Fen. That's all? That is never all, Astrid said gently. But yes. The clock on the mantel chimed once, a low silver note. It seemed perfectly natural after that they would go. Astrid packed them a little parcel of apricot biscuits, gave Thomas a better lamp because his was, quote, adequate but joyless. And she wrapped Ellen's shoulders in a wool cloak much warmer than her own shawl. At the door, Astrid touched Ellen's arm. "You do not need to become different to become more," she said. "Remember that." Then she touched Thomas's sleeve. "And you are not a hinge on which everyone else's safety turns. Remember that too." They stepped back into the moonlit night, carrying words that felt somehow heavier and lighter than before. The footbridge was exactly where the map showed, nearly hidden beneath reeds and wild iris. It arched over a narrow black ribbon of water, reflecting the moon. Beyond it, a path of pale stones wound through tall grasses and flowering fennel. They walked in near silence now. The island at night was full of soft sounds. The brush of wind through reeds, the sleepy chuckle of water, distant sheep shifting in their sleep, the tiny crackle of dry seed heads against one another. Elin felt as if the whole land were awake in a different mode than daytime. Quieter, truer, less distracted. At last, the path opened into a walled garden. Its gate hung crooked on one hinge, but roses had climbed over the stone, and inside grew more beauty than neglect. Moonflowers gleamed among dark leaves, lavender mounded by the path. White foxgloves stood like clustered candles. Old fruit trees leaned protectively over narrow beds, where herbs and pale irises spilled together. At the center was a stone bench beside a round, reflecting pool. The water held the moon. Elin stopped breathing for a moment. "It's beautiful," Thomas whispered. She nodded. The compass in the box grew warm again. "Go on," Thomas said softly. Elin crossed the garden and sat on the bench. She took out the compass and laid it in her palm. The needle spun once, then pointed. Not outward this time, but inward, toward her. It should have been impossible, yet there it was. She almost laughed. Instead, she sat very still. No grand revelation came. No voice spoke. The garden simply continued being itself. And because nothing dramatic happened, Elin began to notice things. The scent of lavender cooling in the night air, the weight of the cloak over her shoulders, the way moonlight silvered at the edges of leaves, the ache in her chest that was not exactly sadness, the fact that she loved this island, not because it was small, but because she had learned vastness through its details, the fact that part of her did want to leave, not to escape, but to discover whether the steadiness she felt here belonged only to this place or had become part of her. The fact that she feared losing the island by going, and feared losing herself by never going. The fact that both fears could be true in part and still not rule her. After a while, Thomas sat beside her on the bench, careful not to disturb the quiet. They watched the pool. Then Elin said, so softly that the garden might have mistaken it for wind, "What if leaving is not betrayal?" Thomas did not answer at once. Finally he said, "What if staying is not failure?" They looked at one another, and both smiled. Not because they'd solved anything completely, but because some knot had loosened. Elin turned the compass so Thomas could see. Its needle still pointed toward her. "It's rude," he said. "It's right." They sat until the moon climbed higher and the chill deepened. Then Elin rose, tucked the compass back in its box, and said, "Come on, Rowan's waiting." Rowan Fenn's cottage stood near the eastern shore, where the reeds gave way to open grass and the sea returned into view. Unlike Astrid's cottage, his was familiar. Whitewashed walls, green shutters, a roof of old tile, and a workshop attached to one side, where warm yellow light spilled through the panes. He opened the door before they knocked. "There you are," he said mildly. "You're later than expected." "You were expecting us?" Elin asked. "Of course." He stepped aside. Rowan's house smelled of cedar shavings, oil, and lemon cake. Clocks ticked from every shelf, though no two agreed precisely. On the workbench lay tiny gears, springs, and a watch the size of a walnut. A black and white cat slept in a basket, lined with scraps of wool. Elin held out the box. "Mara sent this." Rowan took it with surprising reverence. He opened it, studied the compass, and nodded. "Good, very good." "Good for what?" Thomas asked. Rowan shut the lid and set the box on the table. "For mending." He went to a cupboard and brought out 4 plates of cake, which implied he had known exactly how many people would arrive, including, perhaps, the cat. They sat at the round kitchen table while Rowan served tea, stronger and less elegant than Astrid's. At length, Elin said, "Everyone seems to know what's happening, except us." "That," Rowan replied, "is the definition of being young." Thomas laughed into his cup. Rowan folded his hands. "Many years ago, before Mara became keeper of the lantern house, and before Astrid hid herself in a cottage only the willing can find, there were 3 of us. Mara kept light, Astrid kept maps, I kept time." He glanced toward the workshop where the clocks ticked. "We inherited older tasks than people realized. The island is ordinary, yes, but ordinary places can hold deep things. Memory, welcome, return, choosing. For a long while, Bramble Shore had stewards for those matters." Elin listened so intently, she forgot to sip her tea. "The compass," Rowan continued, "was part of that work. When someone stood at a turning point, Mara or Astrid would sometimes set it in motion. It didn't decide. It only revealed where attention was needed." "Why has no one ever heard of this?" Thomas asked. "Because not every true thing improves by becoming public." That sounded like Mara, and Elin smiled. Rowan cut himself a small piece of cake. "We're old now. Mara less willing to admit it than the rest of us, but age arrives whether invited or not. The island will continue. It always does. Yet some things are best handed on, rather than allowed to fade." Elin felt a shift inside herself, subtle and unmistakable. "You mean me," she said. Rowan looked at her kindly. "Perhaps, if you wish." "But if I leave?" "Yes," he said, "even if you leave." She stared at him. He took a thoughtful bite of cake. Do you suppose the work of keeping light is confined to one tower? Or that the art of welcome belongs only to one shore? My dear girl, if you go, you may become lantern keeper in places that have never seen the sea. Ellen's throat tightened. No one had said it that way before. Everyone else had made the choice seem like a contest. Island or elsewhere. Loyalty or ambition. Belonging or growth. But Rowan spoke as if the best parts of Bramble Shore could travel in a person, carried not as a burden, but as flame. Thomas was watching Rowan now with the same fixed attention. And what of me? He asked, trying for lightness but not quite reaching it. Rowan smiled. You keep time already. You notice what phrase. You mend what can be mended. You understand that care is built from small, faithful acts repeated until they become a kind of music. Your grandmother knows this, which is why she sent you into the ash grove. Thomas looked down. She does need me, he said quietly. Yes, Rowan answered. And she also loves you enough not to make her need the boundary of your life. The clocks ticked softly around them. You may go to the city for a season, Rowan said, or stay for a season. Either can be wise if chosen honestly and revisited humbly. Not every decision is forever, though young people are often lied to about that. Elin and Thomas both laughed then, because relief had entered the room and needed somewhere to go. Later, after more tea and the lemon cake reduced to a few lingering crumbs, Rowan carried the box back to the workbench. He opened it once more, touched the silver compass, and then shut the lid. It is done, he said. What did you mend? Elin asked. He glanced at her. Nothing broken, only an old promise between three friends. She wanted to ask more, but his expression was peaceful and closed, in the way of someone who has answered sufficiently for the hour. So, when the time came to leave, she thanked him, and Thomas tucked the remaining apricot biscuits into his coat pocket. The cat opened one eye in official farewell. Outside, the eastern horizon held the faintest paling, the first hint that night was loosening its grip. They'd been out far longer than Elin realized. The walk back across the island was quieter still. Not from fatigue alone, but from fullness. They had spoken enough for one night. The world seemed content to carry the rest. They crossed the footbridge, passed the hidden garden, skirted Willowmere, where mist now pooled in silver ribbons over the reeds, moved through the orchard, where the apple leaves had turned black against the paling sky, entered the ash grove, where dawn birds were beginning their earliest tentative tones. At the ridge, the lantern house came into view far off on the western cliff, its great amber beam still turning, though the stars had begun to fade. There it is, Thomas said. Yes. Neither of them sped up. As they walked, Elin thought of her parents asleep in their cottage, of her brothers tangled in blankets, of her mother's bees beginning soon to stir in their hives. She thought of the college letter tucked in a drawer. She thought of cities she'd never seen, streets with their own weather, rooms where no one would know the names of Bramble Shore's coves. She thought of the hidden garden, Astrid's cottage, Rowan's clocks, Mara's steady hands lighting the lamp. She thought, too, that love of place did not always mean permanence. Sometimes it meant carrying its lessons with such care that they shaped every room you later entered. At the village crossroads, Thomas stopped. The sky behind him had turned pearl gray, and his face looked younger in that light, and also older. "My Gran will pretend to be furious," he said, "and then ask for every detail. Astrid would approve of that." "Yes." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I think I may write the watchmaker and ask whether the apprenticeship could begin in autumn instead of summer." Elin smiled slowly. "That sounds like you." "It sounds like a compromise." "It sounds like a season." He nodded. Then he looked at her more directly. "And you?" She drew a breath of cold dawn air. "I think," she said, tasting the truth of it as she spoke, "I think I will go to the mainland. But not because the island is too small, because I want to see what parts of it are truly mine now. And I think I will come back. Perhaps not forever, but I don't think leaving means losing this." Thomas's expression softened into something warm and proud. "No," he said, "I don't think it does." The church bell in the village gave a sleepy single chime for the half-hour. They smiled at each other in that strange, bright hush that belongs only to the edge of morning, when the world feels newly made and still half dreaming. Then Thomas lifted a hand and turned toward the post road. Elin turned toward the cliff. When she reached the lantern house, Mara was already outside on the terrace with 2 cups of tea. Of course she was. The lamp above still revolved. The sea below breathed against the rocks. Elin climbed the last few steps, and Mara handed her a cup without speaking. They stood side by side, watching dawn spread over the water. At length Mara said, "Well?" Elin held the warm cup between both hands. "Astrid has a hidden cottage." "Yes." "And Rowan bakes lemon cake." "Poorly, but with conviction." "And there's a garden by Willowmere that somehow the whole island forgot." "Not the whole island." Elin smiled. Mara sipped her tea. "And?" Elin watched the horizon brighten from gray to gold. "I think I understand now that choosing is not the same as cutting away." Mara was silent for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Good." They stood there until the sun lifted clear of the sea and touched the windows of the village below. Smoke rose from chimneys, gulls cried, a fishing boat moved out from the harbor like a thought becoming action. Finally, Elin asked, "Did you know what the compass would show me?" "No." "Did you know what I would choose?" "No." "Then why send me?" Mara smiled into her tea. "Because some people require answers. You required seeing." That was so exactly true that Elin could only laugh. Mara set down her cup. "Come inside. The lamp must be lowered, the ledgers updated, and I suspect you've not slept." "I haven't." "Excellent," Mara said. "You are in the correct condition for honesty." Inside the lantern room, The morning light entered through the glass in pale bands. Together, they lowered the great lamp, trimmed the wick, and covered the lens. Mara wrote in the ledger while Elin stood by the window, suddenly overcome by tenderness for every familiar detail. The brass wheel, the polished floor, the faint scent of oil and salt. When Mara had finished, she closed the book. "Elin?" "Yes?" "If you go to the mainland, I'll need someone to assist for the summer before autumn storms begin." Elin turned. Mara's expression was almost casual, but her eyes were not. "I could ask Nessa Pike, though she's careless with glass. Or Jory Bell, though he sings to the wicks and startles himself when they answer by burning faster." Elin laughed. "Are you offering me employment?" "I am proposing a season." The phrase struck gently and landed deep. "A season," Elin repeated. "Yes, stay for the summer. Learn what remains to learn. Then go if you still wish it, with my blessing and Astrid's cloak and Rowan's dreadful cake wrapped for the ferry." Something in Elin settled then, not into certainty exactly, but into trust. "Yes," she said. Mara nodded once, as if this had been expected by someone, somewhere, though not necessarily by her. "Good. Then fetch a clean cloth. The south window has collected fingerprints from your philosophizing." The days that followed moved with the quiet richness of things finding their place. Elin wrote to the college and accepted. Thomas wrote to the watchmaker and requested an autumn start. Astrid appeared twice in the village market, as if she'd never vanished from common knowledge, bought plums, criticized the quality of string, and disappeared again. Rowan repaired the mayor's clock and accepted payment in pairs. Summer edged closer. At the lantern house, Mara taught Elin everything she had not yet taught. The small repairs, the winter procedures, the keeping of old records, the names of currents and winds no modern chart bothered to include. She also, without ever announcing that this is what she was doing, taught her subtler things. How to let silence welcome rather than intimidate. How to tell when a visitor needed tea before questions. How to make a place of steadiness in herself that others could borrow for a while when they had none of their own. Sometimes, in the evenings, after the lamp was lit, Elin sat by the western window and imagined other places beyond the horizon. Streets, libraries, rooms, voices she had not yet heard. She no longer imagined them as threats to what she loved, but as landscapes into which the island might travel inside her. And sometimes, when the weather was clear, Thomas climbed the cliff path after finishing at the post office. He brought seed cakes or village news, or nothing at all except companionship. They would sit on the terrace wall with their feet above the grass and watch the lantern begin its turning. Neither spoke very much about the future now. It seemed less like a storm to prepare for and more like a tide they could meet when it arrived. On the last evening of August, just before Thomas was to leave for the mainland, and a week before Ellen's ferry, the four of them gathered at the hidden garden. Mara brought tea. Astrid brought a tart, Rowan brought a blanket because, as he said, the ground conspires with night air. Thomas brought a tiny clock he had restored. Elin brought honey cakes from her mother. The moon rose over Willowmere. The pool held the sky. The garden smelled of rosemary and late roses. At one point, Mara handed Elin the choosing compass. Its silver casing gleamed softly in the lantern light. "Keep it," Mara said. Elin stared. "I can't." "You can." "It belongs here." Mara glanced around the garden. "Does it?" Astrid smiled into her tea. Rowan pretended sudden interest in the tart. Elin opened the compass. The needle turned once, then pointed not inward this time, nor east or west, but somewhere ahead she couldn't name. "Begin," said the tiny script at the top of the face. She closed it gently and slipped it into her pocket. Much later, when the night had deepened and the others had fallen into easy conversation, Elin stood for a moment alone by the reflecting pool. She thought of all that waited beyond the island, and all that would remain on it. She thought of childhood, and leaving and return, and the strange mercy of not needing to solve one's whole life in a single hour. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of familiar voices, the kind that tell a person they belong somewhere without ever needing to say the word. Above her, stars gathered, and because the night was calm, and the future did not need to be chased, and love had made the world feel both wider and more gentle than it had before, Elin rested there a while, between what had been and what would come, feeling not divided, but held. On Bramble Shore, the lantern turned. On the eastern shore, the reeds swayed. In the hidden garden, the pool reflected the moon, and in one young woman's pocket, a silver compass waited patiently, not to command, but to remind that there would be more than one good road, that leaving and loving could live in the same heart, that welcome could be carried, that light, once learned well, traveled. And when at last Elin closed her eyes just for a moment and listened to the soft chorus of night insects, distant sea, and friendly voices woven together, she felt something deep and quiet settle inside her. Not certainty, something kinder than certainty. Trust. And with that trust beside her, like a lantern set low and steady against the dark, she was ready for sleep.